Your speech yesterday about foreign policy raises a number of questions. You talked about how you would reboot relations with the United States, but what about other aspects? For example, we're at war, obviously, in Iraq and Syria. If elected, would you pull the CF-18s out of Kuwait, say, OK, we're not going to do the bombing anymore?
Well, we've actually put forward a proposal around more humanitarian aid and actually a role for the Canada's military that would be more of a training role behind the lines. I think one of the things that we understand...
Pull out the CF-18s?
Yes, we'd move away from the CF-15 mission to engage Canada's military, and something that we've actually demonstrated a tremendous ability at in Afghanistan and elsewhere, which is to train up local troops to be able to do the fighting on the ground that ultimately ends up defining success in any conflict like this.
I want to ask you more about the trainers in a moment, but first, move away from the CF-18s. That is a yes, right?
Yes,
you
it is a yes.
Pull them out, okay.
Yes.
At the same time as you're improving relations supposedly with the U.S., doesn't that do the opposite? They pleaded with Canada to join in, and we did. You're not exactly going to start out on the best foot in Washington if you basically say no to them on that.
Well, what Washington wants is for Canada, like other nations, to engage fully in the conflict against the ISIL. And the fact is that Canada has many ways that it can contribute, and I feel that the best contribution that Canada can make is around doing something we're very good at and demonstrated tremendous capacity at in Afghanistan, which is training troops on the ground. We need to be engaged as part of this coalition against these terrorists. We just have to be doing something that contributes as best we can, and the United States has always understood that a strong and independent-minded Canada is not just good for Canada, but it's good for the United States as well, to have us able to do things that sometimes they can't or won't do.
You mentioned trainers. You support sending more than the 70 or so that we have there working with the Kurds. Well, so how many more? How many more would it take to make a difference if that's what you want to do?
Well, that's something that we've actually highlighted. The trainers for that are there right now from the JTF tend to be multiple in their roles. We've seen that they're actually actively spotting for the fighter strikes. The challenge that we have is to put forward a responsible plan, and I'll be talking more about that. I have more speeches on foreign policy to come up. Yesterday was really a focus on Canada-US.
So more, but you're not saying how many more?
I won't say how many more right now, no.
A lot of old school liberals, as you know, were not at all happy with your attitude to the mission in Iraq. If you don't like the bombing and you won't really join the military fight as opposed to just training.
Actually, no. I've engaged that the Canadian military has things that it can and should be doing to train. And
but
that's
just not bombing.
Not a combat role.
It's
no.
Staying out of combat and staying far away from the front lines.
I think 10 years ago, we learned through the first Iraq War what happens when Western troops get involved in combat, and they don't necessarily, whether it's Libya, whether it's Iraq, it doesn't necessarily lead to the kinds of outcomes people would responsibly like to see. And what I've committed to staying away from is the kind of easy solutions in a very complex area that this government has specialized in.
But if you don't want to bomb a group as ghastly as ISIS, when would you ever support real military action as opposed to just training?
Terry, that's a nonsensical question. You know that very well. The Liberal Party has always, and I have always been supportive of Canada standing up for its values and taking action when necessary. The question I have for this government, which has failed miserably to do this, is to demonstrate why the best mission for Canada is to participate in a bombing mission, why that is the best use that Canada can have. I truly believe that Canada has a tremendous role to play on the world stage, including with our military, but also around development and diplomacy. And the fact is that this government, with its closed approach, with its lack of forthrightness and honesty with Canadians about the missions, about its outcomes, about its cost, about a plan for success has not instilled confidence in anyone that they know what they're doing around this
And
mission.
when I ask you for your plan for success, you say, well, I'm not going to
I
answer
say-
that right now, maybe later.
Terry, you may have watched the speech yesterday. It was a speech on Mexico and the United States, and I'm happy to talk about that or talk about the principles around Canada that engages in the world. But for the detailed platform, like everyone else, you're going to have to wait till we're closer to the actual election.
Let's try Iran now.
Yes, sir.
It's a big story. Talks are underway, as you know, to hammer out a final deal that would restrict Iran's nuclear program. Relations between Canada and Iran certainly been, well, frosty to put it mildly. For a long time, if re-elected, would you reopen the Canadian embassy in Tehran, restore diplomatic relations?
I think the first thing we have to understand is that a nuclear Iran is a threat not just to the region, but to global stability and security. And that's something that we're therefore cautiously optimistic about the P5+1 process that seems to be making headway on that, and we're gonna monitor that. The one important thing to make a distinction around, though, is the current regime in Iran doesn't necessarily and thoroughly speak for the Iranian people, and making distinctions around the impacts of our engagement or not with them is something that we have to be mindful of. But yes, to answer your question directly, I would hope that Canada would be able to reopen its mission. As I understand it, there were security concerns that led to the closing of the mission, but I'm fairly certain that there are ways to re-engage.
And is that conditional on there being a deal first?
Certainly, it'll be colored by the context in which we find ourselves when we make that decision.